You're watching the Analysis.News, and I'm Talia Baroncelli. Today I'll be speaking to human rights lawyer Stephen Donziger. We'll be speaking about his case against Chevron and why it's absolutely crucial that President Biden now pardon Stephen Donziger. If you'd like to support the work that we do, you can go to our website, theanalysis.news. You can hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. Most importantly, make sure you're on our mailing list. That way we can send all of our content straight to your inbox. You can like and subscribe to our YouTube channel or listen to us on podcast streaming services such as Apple or Spotify. See you in a bit with Stephen Donziger. My guest today is Stephen Donziger. He's a renowned American human rights attorney who's been You're watching the Analysis.News, and I'm Talia Baroncelli. Today I'll be speaking to human rights lawyer Stephen Donziger. We'll be speaking about his case against Chevron and why it's absolutely crucial that President Biden now pardon Stephen Donziger. If you'd like to support the work that we do, you can go to our website, theanalysis.news. You can hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. Most importantly, make sure you're on our mailing list. That way we can send all of our content straight to your inbox. You can like and subscribe to our YouTube channel or listen to us on podcast streaming services such as Apple or Spotify. See you in a bit with Stephen Donziger. My guest today is Stephen Donziger. He's a renowned American human rights attorney who's been fighting for environmental justice and the rights of Indigenous people for his entire career. Most notably, he won a landmark case against the oil giant Chevron, requiring Chevron to pay $9.5 billion in damages to Indigenous communities in Ecuador due to the amount of pollution and toxic waste that Chevron had spilt on their lands. So Chevron subsequently launched a case against Stephen Donziger, accusing him of fabricating evidence in the case. After a U.S. federal court refused to prosecute the case, a judge appointed a corporate prosecutor to pursue charges against Donziger. This court, which was without a jury, found him guilty of being in contempt of court. So he served a total of 993 days under house arrest, as well as time spent in jail for what should have just been a 6-month misdemeanor. So I had the privilege of getting Stephen on the line, and I wanted to ask him why it's so important that Biden now pardon him. So Stephen, it's really great to have you today. We just saw 34 members of Congress write a letter to ask Biden to pardon you. And, this comes after Biden has pardoned a whole bunch of other people who actually committed crimes, but you have not committed the crime that you're accused of having committed. So can you explain why it's so important for Biden to pardon you now and how that would be actually holding big oil to account?
Yeah, well, thank you. I think there's two reasons. One is personal to me. The other really is about what kind of society we want to live in. What happened to me has never happened to anyone else before. And look, there's a lot of people in prison and who have been victimized by flaws in our criminal justice system in the United States. What happened to me is a whole different kind of thing. Basically, I, helped Amazon communities in Ecuador win a landmark $10 billion pollution judgment against Chevron. And in retaliation, Chevron convinced the judge to appoint the company lawyers to stand in the shoes of the U.S. government and criminally prosecute me on a baseless contempt of court charge, which was not a crime. And they really used this case to deny me a jury and to lock me up for almost 3 years on a misdemeanor. A misdemeanor, for those who don't know, has a maximum sentence in prison of 6 months. I was locked up for over 4 times that amount because Chevron prosecuted me. So, on a personal level, getting a pardon is super important because, Chevron persecuted me, abused the law to, restrict my ability to do my work as a human rights lawyer to help the Amazon communities in Ecuador who desperately need legal counsel to really stave off extinction and to remediate their ancestral lands down in the Amazon. And as importantly, a pardon would allow President Biden to send a very clear message to our society that private corporate prosecutions The jailing of human rights lawyers by corporations will never again happen in the United States of America. And, unfortunately, President Biden is my court of last resort because even though several federal judges have ruled the case against me was totally unconstitutional, and 5 jurists from the United Nations have ruled it violates international law, the reality is none of these appellate courts ever reversed, excuse me, my non-jury misdemeanor conviction in quotes. So it really still stands. So, the Supreme Court, even though 2 justices issued a ruling that my conviction was unconstitutional, the rest of the justices wouldn't take up my appeal to even consider it. So, I need President Biden to act. The world needs President Biden to act. The movement needs him to act. Really, everyone who believes in free speech, everyone who engages in advocacy needs him to act. We simply cannot live in a society where corporations can criminally prosecute people and lock them up. And that's what happened to me.
Yeah, I will ask you more about the Supreme Court refusing to hear your appeal. And I think it was Neil Gorsuch who ruled that holding you and detaining you in this manner is unconstitutional. But before we get to that aspect, maybe we could speak a bit more about what the original case was back in the 90s even, and what Chevron, I think it was, the company was Texaco at the time, then was later bought by Chevron, what they were doing, what sort of toxic waste they were spilling in indigenous communities and on their land in Ecuador. And then we can speak about how the case was actually completely hijacked by Chevron and these tactics that are called SLAP, so strategic litigation against public prosecution, how these companies actually engage in those really illegal and shady means of trying to actually target the lawyers who are behind trying to bring justice to the victims rather than pay out damages.
Yeah. Well, so what happened is, Texaco went into this pristine area, the rainforest, way back in the 1960s, and they built hundreds of well sites over 1,500 square mile area of rainforest. And they did not spill the oil. They deliberately designed a system of oil extraction to pollute, that is to offload over time, literally billions of gallons of cancer-causing oil waste into the rivers and streams that the local indigenous groups and farmer communities use as their water supplies, their drinking water. And they use these fresh water sources for fishing, bathing, and their sustenance. And the indigenous groups had lived there for millennia, literally thousands of years. And in a few short years, because of Texaco making this decision, they essentially poisoned the water supply that 5 indigenous nations had relied on, as well as dozens and dozens of farmer communities, tens of thousands of people in this ecosystem, this now beautiful natural ecosystem, which is essentially destroyed. So, when I first went down there in 1993, I saw all this, and I see these open air Olympic-sized pools of oil waste gouged out of the jungle floor with no lining. Many of them had pipes to run the oil waste into the nearby rivers and streams that, again, people were relying on for their drinking water. So we decided, or a small group of lawyers, along with the community leaders down there, to launch this lawsuit in U.S. courts. Ultimately, at that time, it was against Texaco. Chevron later bought Texaco, so they're now the defendant. Mm-hmm. But at that time, the oil company, fought relentlessly for years to move the litigation down into Ecuador's courts because they were so scared of a jury trial in the United States. Eventually, they succeeded in moving it to Ecuador on the condition that they accepted the jurisdiction of Ecuador's courts. Mm-hmm. So to make a very long story short, over the next 8 years, we litigated this case. I say 8 years because Chevron deployed literally dozens and dozens of lawyers to delay and sabotage the trial every step of the way. They simply felt it would be more cost-effective for them to pay lawyers to get in the way of justice than to let the case run its normal course to a conclusion that they were certain to lose based on the evidence. So eventually we overcame all their delay tactics. We won the case, even though they had accepted jurisdiction in Ecuador, even though they had promised to pay any adverse judgment. Instead of doing that, they went after me personally to try to really ruin my life, forced me out of the case because they calculated that given I had a pretty vital role in organizing this lawsuit and, managing the lawsuit and raising the money needed to do the lawsuit. I think they determined that if they could knock me out, and intimidate me into leaving, that the entire case would fall apart. And the people of Ecuador who, even though they're vital, they really, without lawyers, would have no way to defend themselves. So they determined that if they could knock me out, knock the other lawyers out, they could win the case based on might, even though they couldn't win it based on merit. So as a result, they launched what really has turned out to be the most vicious and well-financed corporate retaliation campaign targeting lawyer U.S. history, and I'm the target.
Right, and at some point they then said that they didn't recognize Ecuador's jurisdiction anymore, so they wanted the case to be brought back to the United States, and then they were trying to get $6 million in damages from you, but then they cut that $60 million requirement so that there would be no damages involved. That way they could actually ensure that there'd be no jury. Is that correct?
Well, you got your numbers a bit wrong, but the thrust of it is correct. They sued me for 60 billion, not
Oh, wow.
million. Based on the civil racketeering theory being that the entire mitigation that we had, worked on for almost 2 decades at that point was a criminal conspiracy. I mean, they tried to criminalize the campaign of these Amazon communities and their lawyers to hold them accountable for poisoning the rainforest. They tried to make that into a criminal act. By the way, you see this more and more in American society now with what the fossil fuel industry is doing to activists. And that's what you referred earlier to a slap lawsuit. That's what a slap lawsuit is. It's a lawsuit meant to intimidate and harass and take away people's rights to be advocates, to have free speech. And that's what this lawsuit is. It's probably the mother of all slap lawsuits. Slap lawsuits are totally illegitimate. But often courts, particularly now in the United States, when our courts have moved to sort of generally a very pro-corporate tilt, our courts have moved to the right, a lot of judges are entertaining these cases as a way to help corporations evade liabilities, this being one obvious example. So rather than pay the judgment, they went after me, sued me for $60 billion. When you sue civilly for damages in the U.S., the defendant is entitled to a jury trial under our Constitution. In my case, literally on the eve of trial, they dropped every penny of the damages claims to avoid a jury because they were so scared of a jury. The judge was completely on their side. He was pro-corporate. He was orchestrating it along with their lawyers to try to, help them not pay the liability to the people of Ecuador. It was an awful experience for me personally, to be a defendant in a completely unfair, I would even argue farcical legal proceeding in U.S. courts. So in the end of the day, they dropped the money damages as a way to avoid a jury. The judge predictably would not let me defend myself. He ruled against me, based largely on witness testimony from a man Chevron paid millions of dollars to. Completely illegal. You're not allowed to pay witnesses. The judge let them pay this witness. He lied about me in court, claiming I bribed the trial judge in Ecuador. He later admitted under oath he lied repeatedly in court, but the judge never overturned his ruling against me. It wasn't about truth and justice. It was about using the courts, weaponizing the courts to really stop a brilliantly constructed, campaign and legal effort by vulnerable communities to hold an oil company accountable. So, I sort of fell into this situation in the U.S. where the legal system got corrupted by an oil company, which ultimately led to my detention for almost 3 years.
Could you explain a bit more how this case actually fell under Judge Lewis Kaplan at the U.S. District Court of Manhattan? I mean, who was it that appointed him? And I mean, he has all sorts of ties to Chevron. He's made investments in Chevron and is a corporate lawyer. So that's already super sketchy that he would be appointed. But how did this actually happen? Take us through the steps of that.
Well, this is my opinion. Others differ. Those in Chevron differ. I believe it was all rigged from the beginning, and this is how it happened. Kaplan, who was appointed in the 1990s to a lifetime appointment as a federal trial judge, is known as a very pro-corporate jurist, and he he's sort of a corporate hitman. Like his legal career before he became a judge was to defend the tobacco industry from litigation over, smoking and health problems caused by smoking. So he sort of knew all the tricks of the trade of corporate defense. And he was working with the Chevron lawyers to trick up the case and rig it. And it's not an accident he was assigned to the case. I mean, most, cases are supposed to be, by rule, are supposed to be assigned randomly, but it was not an accident. They steered the case to him. He grabbed the case from the clerk's office and began to work with them to orchestrate this vicious weaponization of the law to try to, attack me as a way of not paying the people of Ecuador and bringing down the judgment. Now, it so happened that in me, he met someone with a fair amount of determination, resilience, and tenacity. I'm far from a perfect lawyer, but I would stand by my clients, and I will fight. So I was able to really mobilize a really good legal team, even though I had virtually no money. People represented me pro bono, and fight back. And ultimately, even though he ended up issuing a judgment, the judgment had like no credibility because the main witness he relied on admitted that he'd been paid millions of dollars by Chevron and lied repeatedly in his testimony about me. That we went to Canada to try to enforce judgment in the racketeering case against me had little credibility. The underlying case in Ecuador had a huge amount of credibility to the point where the Supreme Court of Canada issued a unanimous opinion in 2015 saying the Ecuadorians could sue Chevron in Canada and try to seize their assets. Once that happened, they did another level of trickery where the judge charged me with criminal contempt of court for refusing to turn over my confidential case file to Chevron lawyers, which, by the way, is an unprecedented order. Never happened before in the history of civil litigation in the United States, like forcing a lawyer to give his file to the other lawyers.
I mean, it's
crazy.
A breach of attorney-client privileges, right?
Exactly. It's crazy. It's crazy. Okay. So when I appealed that order, he charged me with criminal contempt of court for not complying with an illegal order he issued that I was appealing. And at that point, the U.S. attorney, which gets these charges from a judge, by the way, the only charge any judge can ever file directly since, the executive branch prosecutes crime, not the judicial branch, but judges are allowed to charge criminal contempt, like when you disobey an order or, act disrespectfully in court. So he used that power to charge me, but the charges go to the prosecutor, the Department of Justice, to prosecute. Well, the Department of Justice of the United States, even under Trump, the Trump administration, refused to prosecute me.
Right.
They rejected this case. At that point, it should have ended. This farce should have ended. Instead, this judge, Kaplan, appointed a private corporate law firm to stand in the shoes of the U.S. government to prosecute me. And it turned out the law firm was really an oil and gas law firm with Chevron as a client. He didn't disclose that.
And that was in 2019, right?
It was in 2019. A law firm called Seward and Kissel was completely conflicted. And the whole entire case was illegal because I was being prosecuted by a judge and a prosecutor he appointed and was supervising rather than the executive branch, the Department of Justice. This became a huge issue on appeal, like it's a technical issue. But bottom line is it was a way to rig a case and orchestrate a persecution of me that ended up putting me in detention at the behest of Chevron lawyers. These are the very lawyers I beat in court in Ecuador, came back and prosecuted me in the name of the U.S. government. And, I just want to tell your viewers here, this is dangerous. This is a corporate playbook. It's really about corporate capture of at least elements of our federal judiciary. I don't know about you, but I don't really want to live in a country where a corporation can criminally prosecute its critic and jail him, okay? And that's what happened to me. And again, that's why a pardon from President Biden is so damn important. I need the pardon to work. I need the pardon to get my law license back, get my passport back, help my clients. Yeah, I definitely need the pardon for that. Our society needs Biden to pardon me because we cannot live in a society where corporations can do this to their critics. And my case, I mean, look, there's a lot of people who deserve pardons. Leonard Peltier, Jessica Resnicek. Many people believe Edward Snowden and others.
And Julian Assange.
And Julian Assange. This case is a whole different animal. And, by the way, I haven't suffered personally. Look, this has been terrible, like being detained, especially when you didn't commit a crime, you know. So there was suffering involved. But I want to acknowledge that my suffering really pales in comparison to those of others who deserve pardons, who have been victimized by our criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. And they deserve pardons too. But in my case, because of this larger issue of corporate power over our courts, it's really important President Biden issue a pardon.
Just a technical question. I mean, usually when a prosecutor brings a case, it would say like United States versus, maybe Donziger in this case. But does it say Chevron versus Donziger? I mean, what do they still put on paper?
No, they put United States, even though it wasn't. Even though the United States had rejected the case, they called themselves the United States, and it's crazy.
Well, I mean, none of it is accurate if the corporate lobbies are, controlling people in government and the court system. It's a sad reflection of reality.
I mean, yeah. And look, I worked in the law and human rights for decades, and I've seen an increasing corporate consolidation of power over our courts and our government and our society. I mean, you remember when Trump came in the first time, the Secretary of State was the CEO of Exxon, Rex Tillerson. So the fossil fuel industry, the oil industry, and a lot of the big industries, pharmaceuticals, for example, insurance, have really penetrated, elements of our government such that they really are able to twist government to serve their interests. It used to be like in the 70s and 80s, 90s even, when I was a young lawyer or even a student, government sort of generally acted as a check on corporate power. Right. Government acted as the neutral party that was really set up to protect minorities, to protect consumers from corporate abuse. That's all changed. I mean, government has now become an instrument of corporate power. And, we're going to see that in full force in this next presidential term. But, we've also seen it through the Clinton years, the Obama years, and now the Biden years. I mean, they are still pretty much captured by corporate influence. Not completely. There's some good things that President Biden has done that corporations did not like. But the power of corporations, the unleashing of corporate money over our political system, the Citizens United case, has frankly completely changed American society. And the place you can most see that, a lot of this is subtle, it's not necessarily visible to the naked eye, but the place where it's most obvious is in our Supreme Court. I mean, our Supreme Court, there's basically 6 unelected justices. By the way, 2 of them back me.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. Why was it that not all of them back you? I mean, this is really a clear case, at least in my view, of I mean, the corporations are at fault here and not you. So why wouldn't they hear your case at the Supreme Court level?
That's a great question. They should have. So think about this. There's 9 justices on the Supreme Court. It takes 4 to accept in a case for appeal, to review the case. So I clearly had 2 who wanted to accept it. 2 of the 6 ultra-conservatives. So what happened to the 3 liberals?
Yeah, what happened to Sotomayor?
All I needed was Kagan or Sotomayor or Ketanji Jackson Brown, 2 of those 3, to side with Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, and my appeal would have been in there. And frankly, I think I would have won my appeal 9-0 or 8-1 or worse 7-2. Like, they would have reversed my conviction. Like, this was BS, and they knew it. And, there were people from all across the political spectrum, from various differing judicial philosophies, who were super offended by the idea that a corporation was able to prosecute somebody. Mm-hmm. It's not that they had any sympathy for the people of Ecuador or for environmental justice lawyering. They were just offended by the idea that a judge, an activist judge, in this case Lou Kaplan, could carry out this ridiculous scheme where he can appoint a Chevron law firm to prosecute Chevron's main critic criminally in the name of the government. So people were offended by that. Mm-hmm. I was really disappointed that I didn't get, 2 of the 3 to bring it up. And, the bigger issue that might be a little technical, my case got caught up a little bit in the politics of the court. And what I mean by that is my case became a symbol of kind of, out of control judicial activism. And the conservatives, that is Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, saw it as a way to help clarify lines of authority such that the executive power, that is the president, his or her power could be strengthened and it could be made clear that only the executive branch, not judges, get to prosecute crime. But because this is sort of a federalist society, you know, tenet, I think the three liberals didn't want to let Gorsuch and Kavanaugh use my case, even though I have such a strong claim, as the vehicle to carry out a Federalist Society kind of power grab for the executive branch. I mean, I don't see it that way, but I think there were certain philosophical differences on the court, and my case got caught up in a larger battle that really had very little to do with the fundamental justice that I'm due. I'll add, though, by the way, there's another court outside the United States called the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention of the United Nations, and they take cases from, individuals who are arbitrarily detained all over the world. There's 5 very respected international jurists, and they took my case and they issued a unanimous decision in 2021 calling my detention arbitrary and illegal. So the United States, in addition to the fact that 2 Supreme Court justices, another federal judge, all found my case unconstitutional under U.S. law. There's now 5 international jurors who have found the entire treatment of me, illegal under international law. So there's a bunch of judges who have determined, who agree with me. I mean, this isn't just me talking, like there's evidence to back my opinion here.
Well, even Amnesty International, I mean, like even the German Amnesty International branch, I'm based in Berlin, like they've been writing all sorts of papers and statements calling for you to be pardoned by Biden. So this is not a partisan issue in any way at all.
That's exactly right. And, by the way, speaking of Amnesty International, I love them. I mean, they have been so supportive of me. They've issued an urgent action calling for President Biden to pardon me. And when I was detained, they issued an urgent action for people to support me, and it really helped protect me in prison. When the prison authorities know that Amnesty is scrutinizing their treatment of a particular prisoner who's in for political reasons. I mean, I was a political prisoner, in my opinion, in the United States of America. They respect you a lot more, and you're able to be more safe. I mean, I was truly, truly fearful that I would be harmed in prison because given how corrupt it had become in the courts, I didn't know how far that power extended. Like, I didn't know if the judge or the Chevron lawyers, could get the Bureau of Prisons, which is the federal bureaucracy that runs our federal prison system, if they could get them to sort of carry out their wishes. So I was scared to go. I mean, I'm not scared to stand for my beliefs or face it, okay? I was scared that I would, frankly, be killed in prison. I was nervous about that. And people, by the way, get killed in prison all the time. Nothing ever happens. It's kind of a lawless environment. So I was fearful of that, and Amnesty really helped protect me. I mean, raising the profile of my case protected me. So I want to take this opportunity to thank them, and I still need their support, and they're still supporting me. So thanks to all the people in Amnesty who also wrote me letters. I mean, I literally got hundreds and hundreds of letters from Amnesty supporters around the world when I was in prison.
Yeah, I mean, you still can't leave the country because of this contempt charge, and Biden hasn't pardoned you yet. But I'm just wondering, when you look at this from sort of bird's eye view, do you see this happening again? Because in this particular instance, it was unprecedented that a judge was able to appoint a prosecutor, even if the federal courts didn't want to do so. So do you see this happening more in the future, or are there any ways to prevent this sort of corporate prosecution from continuing?
Well, this is the only time it's happened. I do think there's a high risk it could happen again, particularly given that no court has stopped it yet. I mean, even though judges have ruled it was unconstitutional, it still stands. So I think a lot of oil companies would take inspiration from the fact Chevron, at least up to now, has gotten away with it.
Right.
So that's the reason why I'm asking President Biden to pardon me. I mean, it's not just about me. It's about sending a message to our society that corporations can't do this. Corporations cannot have this level of power and impunity where they can literally take over our court system to lock somebody up. So, yeah, I think there's a high risk. And by the way, I'll say that, the climate justice movement around the world, given the nature of the climate crisis and the intensifying problems, stemming from our failure to really stop an increase in fossil fuel production, all of that has led to more protests, more activism, more people in the streets. And, in the United States, we're seeing more draconian laws and sentencing of activists. And there's a corporate playbook. The government is, for the most part, been way too compliant and sort of playing along with it to attack activism, to criminalize activists. Jessica Resnicek, who, by the way, also should have her sentence commuted, is a wonderful woman who, during the Dakota pipeline protests, vandalized the pipeline. Okay, she committed an act of peaceful, nonviolent civil disobedience. And so the maximum sentence she could get was 3 years in prison. But the Justice Department went in and asked for an additional 5 years on this weird statute that allows a court to enhance a sentence if someone can be designated a terrorist. So she was designated a terrorist for a peaceful act of nonviolent civil disobedience that was designed to confront, this polluting industry that was, completely destroying indigenous lands in the United States. That's awful. Okay. Climate justice activists are not terrorists, but there is this mass effort by corporate, the fossil fuel industry and other sectors, other corporate sectors in our society to criminalize activism. And way too many state governments are playing along, and our federal courts too often play along. And what happened to me is part of this trend. And that is why, again, it is so important it be stopped. I need to get a pardon. And by the way, there's another thing that needs to happen, which is there's a federal anti-SLAPP law for the first time that has now been filed both in the House and the Senate. Jamie Raskin, he's a great lawyer. He's now the ranking member on the House Judiciary Committee, is leading the effort in the House. And this bill needs to pass. These corporations need to know there will be a price to pay if they keep bringing these SLAPP lawsuits.
Could you speak about climate litigation and some of the cases out there right now that you think are encouraging? I mean, we often see companies such as Chevron or Exxon use the First Amendment to say that they have a right to really not inform the public and to spread inaccurate information about the effects of their toxic spills and, burning fossil fuels. And they've often used the First Amendment against like Greenpeace activists, for example. I know Ted Boutros, who was representing Chevron in a lot of these climate liability cases, actually has ties to Citizens United. He was one of the lawyers who won Citizens United. So could you speak about some of these cases which you think are really important at the moment?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of really good things happening in the climate justice space in courts, not just in the United States, but all over the world. But I want to caution everyone. The courts are not the solution. Okay, courts reflect sort of deeper things going on in other segments of our society, particularly mass citizen action. Courts very rarely lead. They follow. But the courts are the mechanism to implement significant legal changes that are needed to save the planet, which grows out of people organizing and pushing. So I would encourage people who are lawyers and not lawyers to get involved in the climate justice movement and understand that courts, while they have great promise, they have great limitations. Okay, so that's the first thing to really be clear about. The second thing is there are a lot of litigations that I think reflect the growing strength of the climate justice movement. I would say there's two I'd like to call attention to. One is there's a series of cases from various U.S. states against the fossil fuel industry that are suing over the deception, the deceit, that the industry has foisted on our society for decades, essentially lying about global warming, covering it up, funding front groups to create uncertainty, cast doubt on the science, and to keep things sort of uncertain so they can keep producing fossil fuels, which of course are destroying the planet, and keep their sort of protect their profits. So there's a whole series of cases where the industry as a whole, I think 11 states now have these cases, including California, okay, Massachusetts, Maine, and many other states that collectively could create really hundreds of billions of dollars, even trillions of dollars of liability for this industry for damage caused by the deception and the, weather-related damages caused all over this country constantly now because of intensifying hurricane storms, heat, and the like. So there's that series of cases which need to be watched. The industry strategy on those cases is to get the Supreme Court to basically knock them out by saying they deal with federal questions and they should be in federal court. And again, our federal courts are much friendlier to corporations than state courts. So they're hoping that, and Ted Boutros, by the way, the guy you just mentioned, is leading the charge for the industry, trying to get the Supreme Court to just wholesale get rid of all these cases. I don't think the court's going to do it. It would really undermine whatever legitimacy is left of the Supreme Court. So I think they're going to let them twist a little bit and let these cases go forward and maybe deal with them at a later date if they have to. And the other case, which I think is a standalone, fascinating case, is brought by actually a friend of mine, Melissa Sims, is the lead lawyer on a case out of Puerto Rico. This is a different case. It's a federal RICO case, racketeering case. Actually, the same law Chevron, used in a bogus way against me personally.
Right.
There's communities in Puerto Rico. There's the government of Puerto Rico that's using this RICO law to sue all the major oil companies, the American Petroleum Institute, for damages related to hurricanes in Puerto Rico and all sorts of storms. And these damages are probably well over $100 billion, dating back to 2017. That case is really important because it's in federal court. And even if the state court cases get dismissed, that case will survive as kind of the leading case that could create significant liability for the industry. Now, on top of those cases, which are about money, okay, there's other very interesting cases, brought by various youth activists around the country in state court asking for rulings that require state governments to really deal with the fossil fuel problem. This happened in Montana, Hawaii. These kids are winning these cases, and there's something to watch because, all of this is about creating change in government. It's about holding the industry accountable, having state governments, deal with this issue and come up with plans to transition to clean energy. And, all of this is about chipping away at the impunity of the industry. So I'm actually quite encouraged by all the creative climate justice litigation out there. I try to keep an eye on it. I would put our case against Chevron in the same kind of basket of climate cases because, one of the key things to stopping climate change is to make sure if a company pollutes, they pay for the pollution. Because, when they don't pay for the pollution, we subsidize them because we have to pay for the cleanup. So if once companies understand that they have to actually pay for all their costs of pollution, they're going to be much less incentivized to drill in various parts of the world. So, all of these cases are extremely important. All of them matter. And it's really important our government, our Congress, our president protect the political space in our country, protect our democratic rights and freedoms such that we can do this work, that we can be advocates, we can confront corporate abuse, we can have corporate accountability legal cases without being jailed, okay? So, my final point on this is make sure you connect up the litigation with the need to and really all the climate justice protests with the need to preserve our democratic rights and freedoms so this work can be done.
And everyone should go to freedonziger.com. What else can people do right now to urge President Biden to pardon you?
So we're asking, okay, first of all, go to my campaign website, freedonziger, DONZIGER.com. You can sign a petition, and you can also call the White House. The number is 202-456-1111. This is kind of an interesting thing we're doing. We are inundating the White House switchboard from all over the world with citizen calls, leaving a message that President Biden pardon me. It's a little tricky, but make sure you try to get a live voice on the phone. Sometimes it takes a few minutes, and raise some respectful hell with the person who answers, because they keep logs of this, and just be sure that they understand that we are a movement, and there are literally millions of people involved around the world, and we are going to demand this not only for me, for the people of Ecuador, but for all of us who advocate for justice.
All right, Stephen Donziger, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for watching theanalysis.news and for all of your support. See you next time.